Just believe yourself. Don't give up. 여러분 살면서 요즘에 그런 말을 가장 많이 들어봤을 거예요. 공급망, 글로벌 공급망. 정말 요즘에 많이 들어봤어요. 이 신문을 펼치면 뭐 요소수가 없어서 트럭들이 군대 앞에서 줄을 선다? 왜 그러냐 봤더니 뭐 호주랑 중국과의 관계에서 무역으로 마찰이 빚어지고 그리고 전 세계가 요소수에 시달려. 글로벌로 촘촘하게 모든 원자재들이 엮여져 있어서 어디 한 군데가 문제가 생기면 전 세계가 몸살을 앓는 그런 상황이 됐습니다. 그러니까 공급망이 굉장히 촘촘하게 여러 단계로 연결되어 있는데 그중에 하나만 문제가 생겨도 디젤을 보충하는 액이 없는데 물건을 못 사요. 화장지를 살 수가 없어요. 바나나를 못 사요. 이게 공급망이더군요. 저 솔직히 몰랐습니다. 이 요시셰피 교수 이 책을 쓴 이번에 여러분 이 뉴 앱노멀이라는 이 책을 쓴 요시셰피 교수도 와이프가 자기 남편이 뭐 하는지 몰랐대요. 그러니까 이게 공급망이 어려운 거예요. 그래서 남편 뭐 하냐 그러면 MIT 교수인데 뭐 하세요? 그러면 뭐 공급망 어쩌고 하는데 뭐 하는지 모르겠어요. 근데 요번에 팬데믹 때 화장지 떨어져 보고 이거저거 우리 떨어져 봤잖아요. 그걸 경험해 보고 나서 공급망이라는 게 이렇게 중요하구나 라는 걸 사실 이 책을 처음 접했을 때 공급망 나랑 무슨 상관이야? 라는 생각으로 지켜봤는데 쭉 읽으면서 여러분이 반드시 이 책을 통해서 한 가지 인사이트를 가져야 된다는 건 뭐냐면 앞으로 위기가 닥칠 때마다 이런 걸 어떻게 예측하고 내가 만들어 나가야 되는지 측면에서 여러분들이 보셨으면 좋겠습니다. 그리고 제가 요시셰피 교수한테 한 가지 제대로 배운 게 뭐냐면 서플라이 체인적 측면에서 모든 상황을 분석해 보는 거예요. 이 책이 내가 서점에서 주문해 샀잖아요. 온라인에서. 그럼 이 공급망을 한번 상상해 보는 거예요. 이게 되게 재밌더라고요. 공급망을 쭉 상상해 보면 적어도 12가지 이상의 산업들이 이 공급망 안에 작동하고 있구나. 그중에 하나만 잘못되면 큰일 나겠네. 근데 사실은 이 책을 소매에서 파는 사람보다 이 공급망 누구에겐가도 이익이 골고루 분배돼야 되기 때문에 여기서 직업이 생기는 거구나. 책 그러면 이걸 파는 직업만 생각하지만 이 많은 공급망 중에 수많은 직업들이 숨어 있구나를 상상하면서 되게 재밌었습니다. 공급망 측면에서 생각해 봤을 때 나는 어떤 직업을 하는 게 나한테 어울리지? 그래서 공급망적인 사고를 할 수 있다면 저는 직업을 선택하는 데 있어서도 훨씬 더 폭넓게 생각하고 아이들의 미래도 훨씬 더 폭넓게 생각할 수 있다는 생각을 했어요. 그래서 요시셰피 교수는 아마 요즘에 가장 인기 있는 사람인 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 공급망에 다 문제가 생기니까 다 요시셰피 교수한테 전화해서 물어보는 거예요. 이거 언제 끝날 것 같냐? 언제 회복될 것 같냐? 사실 이런 생각 해보셨어요? 우리 여기 살아가는 모든 인구 공급망 안에 어딘가에 다 위치해 있어요. 모든 걸 한번 이해하는 게 굉장히 중요합니다. 여러분들 이 책을 보시면서 그런 인사이트를 얻으셨으면 좋겠습니다. Alright. Hi, my name is MK Kim. It's very nice to meet you, and thank you for joining us today. My guest today is an expert in supply chain management. He teaches at MIT. Professor Yoshi has consulted with numerous government agencies as well as manufacturing and retail enterprises all over the world. He's also an entrepreneur and a sought-after speaker. Today, he joins me to talk about his new book, The New Abnormal: Reshaping Business and Supply Chain Strategy Beyond COVID-19, and to give us some insight into a global supply chain crisis. We hear so much about in the news these days. I'm really looking forward to hearing his thoughts today. Professor Yoshi Sheffi, welcome to my show, MK Show. How are you?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
So first, I'll hand over the mic to you so you can present your ideas, and then we'll have a Q&A session.
So good morning, everybody. As was presented, I'm Professor Yossi Sheffi. I'm the director of the MIT Center for Transportation Logistics. And I'll talk to you about the book that I published last year. It's called The New Abnormal: Reshaping Business and Supply Chain Strategy Beyond COVID-19. So let's start with what I call the Anna Karenina principle. Tolstoy said, happy family are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. By the same token, every disruption comes with its own variation of problems. Not two are really the same. But on the other hand, the management of most risk and disruptions involve prevention, detection, and response. So there are generic preparation steps. So if we look at the preparation steps, the main idea is that one prepare options for the people who have to respond. That's the essence of preparation. So building in redundancy, whether it's a multi-sourcing, having multiple suppliers, having some emergency inventory, or mapping all your suppliers, but beyond mapping, understanding not only their location so you can be alerted if something goes wrong, but also attaching the bill of material to the network of suppliers and plants. So if something goes wrong in one of them, you know which part is being made there, what product it goes into, and which customer is using this product. So this is an example of one of the software apps that does these things. There are several companies that provide these services. And the essence of preparation is to develop flexibility. And there are many examples in the book, cross-training by UPS, standardization. Intel has all its plants arranged in a standard way. Developing collaborative relationship with other company along the supply chain and even competitor, postponing the customization of every product until the last minute, and finally having the right culture. This has many elements. Culture has many elements, including being able to speak truth to power, to be able to act immediately without getting all kind of permissions, and several other cultural issues that I describe in the book. But once a crisis happens, there are certain elements of managing the crisis. The first one is to stand up what's called emergency management center. Many companies have it in a special room, but during the pandemic, of course, it was all virtual. But this is basically a group of managers that get all the information from around the network, around the world, and this is where decisions are being made. Spending time on communication, one has to communicate obsessively during a disruption, because the market, the customers, the suppliers, if there's no continuous communication, they will assume the worst, because they assume that you are afraid to tell them the truth. You have to make sure that ahead of time, you decide on a priority. If you don't have enough product to give all your customers, how do you decide which customer gets what? Companies have to decide on a process beforehand, and not doing the last minute under the pressure of every customer screaming for product. In many cases, supply chain crisis happen during a recession, and in that case, finance becomes king. And you have to make sure that you don't increase terms of payment to suppliers by too much, because suppliers may be at risk. Many companies reduce the number of stock keeping units. This is an example of General Mills that reduced the number of Progresso soups from 90 variety to 50 variety. But many companies do it during a recession or any kind of other disruption. It happens a lot during the pandemic. Finally, it is, as they say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And during a crisis, it's a very good opportunity to find out who are the good employees, who are the good customers, who are the good suppliers, who are the divisions that operate well. And one should come out of the pandemic stronger by deciding to work with the good suppliers, with the good customers, and with the good employees. So let's talk specifically about the pandemic and the aftermath. So, at the beginning, we thought, what will be the recovery like? V, will go down and then back up, or stay down, or and then go up, or just stay down, or seesaw back up and down. Now, who did COVID-19 hit? Of course, it hit the people, mostly old people or people with previous conditions. Same thing with companies. Weak company, already deteriorating, over leverage were the companies that were hit. So, for example, US department stores in March 99, the revenue was, all the department stores were $30 billion. Just before the pandemic, it was $11 billion. Now it's less than 8. Many companies have went bankrupt, left the market. On the other hand, other companies adjusted. Other companies were able to help society. For example, automobile companies in the United States started making ventilators. Other company adjusted. For example, Burberry started develop an app that started showing people how to use their product. This is a company that makes custom leather jacket, and these are actually videos that they were explaining to people how to take measurements and get the custom leather jacket. Sephora, again, was using the same models online, same model they use in the store, use them online in order to explain to women how to apply cosmetic, to men as well, I guess. IKEA developed a augmented reality app when you can look at something on the stores and put it in your room and see what it's going to look like. And several other companies develop similar product. Right. Of course, e-commerce took off, increased substantially. This is some of the big retailers. They grew up, but the e-commerce grew much more. And of course, Amazon, JD.com, Alibaba, all grew up substantially. A company like Shopify that makes Shopify is a company that allows small retailers to get online. They do everything they need to get online. They have 1.3 million customers during the pandemic. And even Facebook started getting into e-commerce. Then talk about the end of just-in-time. A lot of the media is talking about, now the end of just-in-time. Again, the Toyota production system, which just-in-time is of course part of it, is one of the most important manufacturing and supply chain innovation ever. Yes, it called, one of the tenets of this, one of the principle here is minimizing inventory, but the result basically is both resilience and flexibility, because you are tied much stronger to your customer and to your supplier. You know them better, so the whole channel can react when there's a problem much better. It also, the most important thing is to understand is that at least the media in the US and the EU was talking about greedy companies are doing just in time because they're trying to save money in inventory. That is actually nonsense. Just-in-time inventory in the Toyota production system led to high-quality product. And because product were high quality, costs went down because you didn't have warranty problem, you didn't have rework problem, you didn't have bad reputation. Also low waste and worker participation, a lot of good things. So it led to low-cost, high-quality product. And when Toyota came up with it, and Honda and some others followed it, if some listener may recall that there was a time that the US put voluntary quota on Japanese cars because they were gonna destroy the US automotive industry, which has too many people, too many jobs, so it's politically very hard. And interestingly, now the Koreans are trying to do to the Japanese what the Japanese did to the American manufacturer company. The number one SUV vehicle in the United States is now the Kia Telluride. A Kia is the number one car as by a metric of quality of and performance. Now, will people go out of China? Not so quickly. Not so quickly. Many companies are not in China only due to low cost. This is diminishing advantage. Costs in China, especially along the eastern seaboard, whether you talk about Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, costs are getting pretty high. In fact, companies who move to China because of low cost, companies that in the garment manufacturing, for example, are moving out of China. In fact, they're in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Even Chinese companies are not in China anymore. So it's not, people are not in China anymore for just low cost. But at this point, they're just very good suppliers. So it's very hard to leave China. Furthermore, people who are not in supply chain don't understand that it's not just one supplier. It's a whole ecosystem of suppliers. Chinese suppliers will have sub-suppliers. They have sub-sub-suppliers and sub-suppliers. So there's a whole network of suppliers. It's not easy to get the whole thing out of China. So, yeah, companies are doing what's called China plus one. Sometimes they'll invest incremental money in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, sometimes even in Mexico if it's United States, or Turkey if it's Europe. But that's really marginal. Because even if they move the first tier suppliers out of China, the whole rest of the supply chain stays in China. Let's not forget also that China is still a very large and growing market, and companies who want and becoming more and more nationalistic, which means the company that want to sell in China have to make it in China. So I don't see companies leaving China. As I said, maybe balance a little bit, but I don't see them leaving China. So let's look at what's next. Well, we'll probably see already more intrusive governments, not just in the US, but spend so much money on developing vaccine and helping the economy that the debt becoming very high. In many countries, there's more control over people. Use the same app that we used to look at COVID and contact tracing to control people and movement and surveillance. We see industrial policy. Companies are starting to develop inventory critical items. Companies either will have inventory, especially for things like PPEs, but also for semiconductors and other important material, critical supply, or they develop local manufacturing. There's a lot of buy local mandate. I mentioned the developing critical manufacturing and Green New Deal. A lot of talk, of course. We just came out of the Glasgow conference. A lot of emphasis on sustainability, but huge deficit that lead to inflation. I talk about sustainability. Despite all the talk about sustainability, I predicted, by the way, that Glasgow will come out with almost nothing. You didn't have to be a forecast expert in order to realize this, that if you look at the Paris Accord and how little was actually done after the Paris Accord, and you look at people are just not willing to adjust their lifestyle. We can talk more about what needs to be done, but this is just a concern. And as countries around the world are becoming less rich, in many cases, sustainability becomes a luxury good. By the way, we see it in China and India today. As the cost of oil is going up, they started burning more coal. They don't pay attention now to reducing emissions. They have to support the local economy. Working from home, of course, we all work from home, or many of us work from home. I'm talking now to you from home, even though I'm going to the office every day. But many people, even at MIT, still work from home. But working from home means there's maybe a new globalization, a new labor globalization, and this will be white collar globalization. Because if my office is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If I can work from Florida or California, I can also work from Buenos Aires or Seoul, and it means that my taxes go with me. That I'm now highly paid, or white collar people are highly paid, and they will pay taxes where they work. So this may create another tension between countries. There was a lot of inequality exposed. Found out that some people have broadband and they can get good education online, and other people don't. So that's, by the way, part of the move in the US now, why they included broadband access in the infrastructure bill that was just passed this week by the Biden administration. Finally, have to think about the next pandemic. It will be maybe more contagious and deadlier, or maybe there will be a big cyber attack, whatever. A lot of other dangers. Let me finish by talking about today's challenges, that we see the shortage of every part and every product. We see shortage of transportation capacity, long and uncertain delivery time, shortage of workers, hoarding by companies, high and still increasing prices. So all of these are symbols. We can talk about why this is happening, and I don't know when it will finish, but this is happening now, not only in the United States. The inflation going up in the EU, inflation going up in several parts of Southeast Asia. Part of it is because we spend too much money, give people too much money, and they couldn't spend it on services because they couldn't go to a movie, they couldn't go to bars, they couldn't go to gym. So the minute that they got the vaccine, they started buying stuff, and demand went up significantly, and supply could not catch up. Also, because people had money, a lot of workers didn't come back to work. But that was a policy mistake. Anyway, let me finish here.
Thanks for sharing your insight. Yeah, that was a very great presentation. It is very insightful and so timely. With that in mind, I'd like to pick your brain some more and ask you some questions. You know, in your book, you say that one new normal will be a major disruption in education, especially higher education. From a supply chain perspective, where the students are the consumers and universities are the suppliers, do you think that universities responded well to the pandemic? And looking ahead, how do you predict universities will operate in the future?
Okay, so this is an ongoing experiment, basically. At MIT, we are mostly back in class, but we have people who cannot get visa to come to the United States. So we have to do a hybrid. So we are teaching and still transmitting it, and it does not work very well. Honestly, it does not work very well. It works well when you do totally virtual or totally in person. The combination, I don't think anybody has found a good way to do it. There are a lot of technologies developing to be able to do it better, but mostly they are for business meetings. There are technologies that now, the camera goes automatically to the person who speaks and all this. They're not good for classes, especially large classes. You have 30, 40, 50 students in a class or more. It doesn't work because you cannot get the virtual student, to participate the same way that you have. And you find yourself, at least I find myself, you either talk to the camera or you talk to the students that sit in the class. It's very hard to move back and forth. So it is still a work in progress. As I said, a lot of technology are being developed, and maybe we'll be better in this. But I think for a long while, we will stay in a hybrid mode.
So what about the quality of education? The many students, maybe they're gonna asking about return the tuition fee because it's not a face-to-face classroom situation. So it is an online class. Then maybe they're gonna ask return the tuition fee, maybe 50% or 30%. But what do you think about that?
Some school gave some money back. Some school did not. I don't think too many engineering school and science school gave the money back because you get the content. But in general, looking forward, one of the good things that came out of the pandemic is that you can now study anything you want online. There are so many courses, many of them are free. When we talk about one of the things that people worry about is automation and people losing their jobs. I was giving a talk to a group of workers at the warehouse, at the Amazon warehouse, and they were worried about automation and robotics, and they're going to lose their job. And I told them, look, you have to think about your future by yourself. Don't worry about the company. You have to train yourself for the next job, because yes, robotics will come and will replace what you do. So what do? You have to learn computer science. You have to learn, and it's easy because you have so much online at any level that you want. You have to be responsible for your own future, and the company is not going to take care of you.
Okay, pay attention to next education in the future, because I established online education platform last year.
Yes, you told me.
So yeah, you mentioned in your book about the higher education system. So you said, yeah, Google or some it's a big online platform, they're gonna take that whole education system, because they have everything, education system, and then big search form, like a Google or like a, it's a LinkedIn or job market. They have everything. So we are concerned about that,
Yeah, I think that what happens is the following.
Oh yeah.
Companies like Google, how can they grow? They're already $1 trillion company. $1 trillion.
Yes.
That's enormous. How can they grow? Well, they can move into other areas. They cannot grow in search. They got all the search, or almost all of it.
Okay.
They cannot grow in advertising. They get as much as they can. They can get into new areas. So there are two big areas of the economy. It's healthcare and education. And
Yes.
at the end of the day, they have to go there, because that's the only way that they can grow at this rate, at the rate of trillions of dollars. They need to grow at this much. If they want to grow from $1 trillion company to $2 trillion to $5 trillion company, they need to take whole industries. And that's what I was talking about. I just look long term at how can these companies grow. However, let me just say, the government may stop them.
Oh.
Government may decide they're too big and stop them. And whether it's the US Justice Department or the European Competition Commission, the government is now starting to realize that this is a risk, that they're becoming. By the way, the Chinese government is doing this. They were cutting down Alibaba. They were cutting down, so even the Chinese realize that it's a risk to the economy. Now, in China, it's also a political risk, but here it's an economic risk of too much concentration. But many people are paying attention to this, so maybe it's not going to happen as I predicted.
So you mentioned in your preface that Korea had dealt with COVID very well. What advice do you have for Korean companies that still face an uncertain future?
First of all, it's not only Korean companies, every company. It's when I say Korea dealt well, first of all, they dealt much better than the US with the pandemic in general. But also some Korean companies like Korean Air, at one point in 2020, was the only profitable airline in the world, one of the two most profitable airlines, because they understood and moved very quickly to cargo freight. And some other airlines did not believe that the passenger will come back and didn't change. Korean Air took all the big airplanes that they have and started moving cargo. So they actually made money during the pandemic. One of the few airlines that they made more money than anybody else, and there was one other airline, but that's about it. So this is an example of adjusting very quickly, understanding the problem, and doing something about it. Some other companies are simply structured well. Take a company like Samsung. Samsung is very much vertically integrated. So they make their own chips, for example. So they don't have to depend on Taiwan Semiconductor, not for everything, but they make a lot of their own parts. So they don't have to depend on others. Many Korean companies came out okay, not great, and some not everything, but by and large, Korean companies did okay. Advice to face uncertain future. I talk about it in my book. You have to drill, you have to make plans, and understand it. Making plans. Eisenhower General Eisenhower was president of the United States, and the commander of the Allied forces during World War II, said, the planning, the plan is not important. The plan is not important. The planning is important. Going through the process of planning, you go to several possibilities and what will happen. Then you have a plan. It may work, it may not work. But going through the process of thinking about what can happen and what you do about it is very good. So, and again, preparing alternatives. I know auto companies, for example, with one forecast and then one high forecast and one low forecast, and get, okay, if we know if we get high forecast, we have to pay overtime, and we have to make, if we get low forecast, we have to reduce the price of the car. So how all the finances work, and do a whole plan for more than one scenario. So do scenario planning, building in flexibility, making sure that people are trained to do multiple jobs, make sure that information flows very quickly to the top, especially if it's bad information.
Yeah, very insightful. As you know that we are currently facing a serious global supply chain crisis, but this is a very difficult question, but when do you think this situation will get better?
And the government doesn't want to start increasing rates because this will, tank the stock market and the housing market and the automobile market. People will buy less. So they're not doing this. But the question is, how bad will inflation be? If inflation will start going, last month it went 6% in 1 month up, that's a lot.
Yes.
Year over year, it went 6%, over 6%, that's enormous. So if this will continue at this rate, the government will have to do something because inflation will become worse than anything else. Right. So if the government will do it, this will stop the shortages. If there'll be less money, if demand has to go down, before demand goes down, nothing will happen because the supply will take years to catch up. The time to build factories, to build new ships, you need time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years, basically. So, yeah, 2-3 years from now, everything will be over, but there will be a lot of misery between now and then. A lot of it depends on how fast the government will stop pumping money into the market.
That is very insightful for not only suppliers, but also consumers, as a consumers, okay? Okay, the next question is slightly different question, Much of today's younger generation prefer online spending to offline spending. The many economic activities are conducted online. There's online shopping, online games, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and so on. But the excessive amount of electricity used in order to make online transactions, like Bitcoin and NFTs, can have a negative impact on sustainability. So, in a long run, which is more sustainable, offline or online economic activities?
It's very hard to give a general question. But first of all, cryptocurrency is awful. It takes enormous amount of energy to develop, Bitcoins and all the other crypto. It's particularly bad. You cannot even compare it to just regular online transactions, because regular online transactions that you do with your credit card are not nearly as bad as mining for Bitcoins. It's really take enormous amount of energy. But in general, when you talk about online, depending on the level of service. So if people were okay to get something within 3 or 4 days, online would be, e-commerce would be a very good alternative. Very good, better than going to the store, because you can have full truck or full vans, giving the product very efficiently. The van gets full and give the product to many, goes around the neighborhood and give the product to many people. However, if the level of service, like it is in many American cities, 2 hours, I can order something from Amazon and get it in 2 hours. What it means is that if you understand supply chain, it takes them at least an hour to find where it is in the warehouse. And then they put it on a van and it goes directly to my home. Otherwise, they're not going to make it in 2 hours. This is very, very inefficient and waste a lot of energy. So a lot of it depends on the level of service.
Okay, and you know that as an individual, I admit I wasn't aware of how far-reaching supply chain could be. One country's action can affect everyone around the world because we are so interconnected globally, right, economically. You know, I confess I haven't no idea about what is global supply chain. You know that you said your wife didn't know what my husband is doing about, okay, like that. So this is really, I really want to say appreciate you. But today's talk has been really eye-opening. I think this is a great opportunity for people to have even a slight idea of what the supply chain is and how much it affects on our daily lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a great pleasure. 자, 여러분 도서 나눔 이벤트 해볼까요? 요시세피 교수님 사인은 없습니다. 미국 가서 받아야 되니까 그냥 이 책을 10권을 나눔해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 자, 여러분 이 책의 제목을 적어주시면 되겠습니다. 이 책 제목 좀 특이하거든요. 자, 이 책의 제목을 적어주시는 분께 10분께 이 책을 보내드리도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그리고 이 영상이 좋으셨다면 좋아요, 구독, 알람 눌러주세요. 오늘의 분교약본을 받고 싶으시다면 이곳을 클릭하세요.